In the 5th century BCE, the land of Qin was merely a barren, desolate frontier on the very edge of civilized China, poor, sparsely populated, with backward nobles, chaotic laws, and regarded by the other vassal states as barbarian trash not worth bothering about. Vast tracts of land lay fallow, agricultural output was pitifully low, and its army was so weak that it couldn't withstand even a medium-scale campaign from Zhao or Wei. Qin was a place people wanted to flee from, not a destination anyone dreamed of reaching. Yet just a few decades later, from that very same wasteland once dismissed as peripheral, a superpower rose at a speed that stunned the entire ancient world. Fields were reclaimed on a massive scale. Grain production far surpassed that of neighboring states. Weights, measures, script, and taxation were standardized. Straight roads cut through mountains and forests, and the army was reorganized into a war machine so efficient it was nearly invincible. In 221 BCE, Qin didn't just defeat each of the strongest states of the Warring States period one by one. It unified the whole of China and built the first highly centralized imperial state in East Asian history. The transformation was so rapid it seemed almost irrational, from the weakest to the strongest, from the most despised land to the first empire. What caused that colossal leap? Who was the architect behind the economic military miracle that scholars still argue about today? And the cruelest paradox of all, why did an empire built so quickly collapse within a single generation? This is not just the story of the rise of the Qin Dynasty, it is also the story of the power of reform, the limits of coercion, and a historical lesson that never loses its value. An empire can explode out of a desolate frontier, but it can also vanish the moment it reaches its peak. To understand how the state of Qin was able to produce one of the fastest and most radical economic military miracles in all of ancient history, we must first return to the world before that miracle began. A world that was unstable, impoverished, and lacked any order strong enough to keep society from sliding into chaos. The Warring States period was not merely an era of war, it was an era in which war had become the operating mechanism of the entire political system. Millions of people grew up amid constant fighting, dying from famine, disease, conscription, or being forced to abandon their homes. The 7 major powers, Qi, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qin, functioned simultaneously as states and as war enterprises, endlessly fighting over every inch of land, every person, every grain of rice. No one stayed strong forever, and no one stayed weak forever. All were trapped in a bloody war of attrition that lasted more than 2 centuries. In that vast, smoke-filled picture, the state of Qin started from the very bottom. Qin lay on the western fringe, far from the Wuxia cultural heartland, regarded by the Central Plains states as a half-barbarian borderland, poor and backward. Despite its huge territory, Qin had so few people that every time it mobilized for war, the country risked a critical shortage of labor for production. It had plenty of arable land, but much of it lay fallow. It had resources, but could not exploit them, and the wealth it did produce was not even enough to feed its own population. None of the major warring states' powers regarded Qin as a real rival. They saw it either as a convenient buffer or as territory that could be annexed when the opportunity arose. The people of Qin themselves lived with an inferiority complex, surrounded by enemies who were more cunning, richer, and more populous. Qin's first and most critical crisis was land, the heart of every ancient agrarian economy. For generations, land had been monopolized by entrenched aristocratic clans. Peasants worked the lord's fields, handed over most of the harvest, and essentially lived as slaves their entire lives. No one had any incentive to increase productivity, because no matter how hard they toiled, they only earned just enough to avoid starvation. The result: fertile soil lay idle, wasteland spread, people fled, and the economy collapsed. A huge country that produced less than smaller states. This was not just weakness, it was catastrophe. But land was only the surface of the problem. Beneath it lay the deeper rot of the administrative apparatus. There was no unified legal code, no standardized weights and measures, no uniform tax system. Every commandery did things its own way. Every official had his own rules. Even the army was organized along clan lines. Its strength varied by family, and it frequently disobeyed central orders, if those orders threatened private interests. With such a fragmented system, Qin was not truly a state, but a loose collection of hundreds of mini-states, nominally under a royal house that had almost no real power. Local laws overlapped and contradicted one another. Merchants who wanted to travel through a few commanderies had to change their scales, axle widths, wheels, and tax units, an absolute nightmare that made commerce practically non-existent. An economy chopped into countless tiny pieces could never grow, and when commerce did not grow, the state remained forever poor. But Qin was not merely poor. Qin was hungry and growing hungrier. Qin's population fell sharply decade after decade due to failed harvests, epidemics, and war. So much land lay abandoned that there was no one left even to reclaim it. Young and able-bodied people fled en masse to Zhao's Wei, where life was easier. Those who remained simply tried to survive day to day, a country that was losing its people, its labor, and its hope was a country walking slowly toward extinction. The demographic crisis caused everything else to collapse in a chain reaction. No farmers, no production, no tax revenue, no army, no defensive territory, no state. And then there was the military crisis, Qin's fatal weakness. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the Qin army was judged to be one of the weakest among the major warring states' powers. Its equipment was outdated, training was haphazard, organization was poor, discipline was lax, and most critically, it never had enough food to sustain prolonged campaigns. While Zhao developed heavy armored infantry, Wei pioneered siege warfare, and Qi fielded huge, well-supplied armies, Qin could only use its meager forces for makeshift defense. Aristocratic commanders took their private troops into battle whenever they pleased without coordination or obedience to the central government. A state like that could not win. A state that could not win could not survive. All of this brought Qin to a frightening parallel with Weimar Germany. A crumbling state, a fractured society, a ruined economy, a population that had lost faith, and a government unable to control the situation. Weimar had hyperinflation. Qin had vast tracts of abandoned farmland. Weimar had mass unemployment. Qin had tens of thousands fleeing every year. Weimar had a debt crisis. Qin had chronic food shortages. Weimar became radicalized. Qin was so fragmented by its aristocracy that the king was almost powerless. The similarity, both stood on the edge of the abyss, facing only two paths, radical reform or annihilation. And this was precisely the context in which a new school of thought appeared. Legalism Fagia. Legalism was nothing like Confucianism. It did not try to improve people through morality. It was nothing like Daoism. It did not believe in the natural harmony of all things. Legalism believed in absolute law, centralized administration, iron discipline, officials appointed solely on merit, severe punishment for sabotage, and lavish rewards for contribution. Legalism was a philosophy designed for times of chaos, because it required neither consensus, nor tradition, nor benevolence, only results. It was the only ideology cold enough to confront the crisis Qin was living through, and Qin, unlike Zhao, Qi, or Wei, which were deeply bound to long aristocratic traditions, possessed a paradoxical advantage. It had very little left to preserve and a great deal that needed to be destroyed. The state that was despised, hemmed in, and eroded to the point that mere survival was difficult would more readily accept radical ideas than a state that had long been stable. Qin had no choice left. If it continued as before, it would be swallowed by Zhao or Wei within a few decades. If it attempted half-hearted reforms, it would only weaken itself while its rivals grew stronger. Thus Qin faced a life-or-death decision, either completely rebuild the structure of the state or disappear from the map forever. And it was in that darkest historical moment that a man appeared who carried the most radical legalist thought of the age, a man who believed a state could be entirely rebuilt using nothing but law, organization, and discipline. An architect of change, resolute, cold-blooded, and unafraid to confront the aristocratic machine that had dominated Qin for centuries. That man was Shang Yang. From the moment he set foot in the state of Qin, the history of China turned to a completely different chapter, a chapter of reform, of absolute power, of total mobilization, and of an economic miracle that would overturn the entire balance of the warring states period. Born into a minor aristocratic family in the state of Wei, Shang Yang grew up in a political environment filled with scheming and cutthroat competition, where he soon realized something that most scholars of his time dared not admit. People do not act out of morality or ideals, but out of benefits and punishments. From a very young age, he broke away from the traditional Confucian way of thinking and turned toward legalism, a cold, sharp doctrine that saw law as the supreme tool for shaping society and iron discipline as the only true foundation of national strength. Yet it was precisely these ideas, too radical and too dangerous, that kept him from being valued in Wei, where the nobility was so powerful that any hint of change was strangled the moment it appeared. Shang Yang left Wei in disappointment, but not in despair. He understood that his philosophy could only survive in a country that had been exhausted to the point of having nothing left to lose and was willing to gamble its entire future on a reform unprecedented in history. That country was Qin. When Duke Xiao of Qin was desperately searching for a way out for a dying state, he heard of Xiangyang's reputation and immediately summoned him. From their very first meeting, the Duke recognized that the man before him was not an ordinary learned scholar, but a mind ready to shatter every old mold. Xiangyang did not speak of reviving tradition or improving morality. He spoke of abolishing aristocratic privileges, centralizing power, standardizing the law, judging people solely by results, and building a state based on efficiency rather than bloodline. These were ideas that only a ruler who had touched absolute rock bottom would dare to listen to. Yet when those proposals were presented to the court, the entire Qin aristocracy erupted in fury. The families who had held power for centuries instantly understood that this reform program was not piecemeal adjustment. It was the total erasure of the system from which they profited. Xiangyang immediately became public enemy number one of the entire noble class. They tried every means to block him, slander him, and on several occasions even plotted to execute him before the reforms could begin. But what set Xiangyang apart was his ice-cold composure in the face of all pressure. He knew that Qin's survival allowed no compromise. A nation that was dying did not need painkillers. It needed surgery, and he had not come to Qin to patch things up. He had come to rebuild from the ground up, like Schacht in the story of Nazi Germany. The man behind the economic machine that lifted Germany from ashes back to superpower status. Xiangyang was neither general nor king, yet he was the one who designed the entire operating model of the state. He looked at Qin as a colossal structure rotting from within and began rewriting every single part of it: law, land, taxation, military, and administration. What made him dangerous to the ruling class was this: he made no distinction between rich and poor, noble and commoner. In his eyes, everyone had to stand equally beneath the law. No clan was exempt. No tradition was preserved if it hindered efficiency. No power could exist outside the hands of the state. And it was precisely this uncompromising radicalism that made the great families hate him to their very marrow. Yet it was also what made Duke Xiao trust him more than anyone else. With the Duke's protection, Xiangyang finally had the chance to implement what he believed was the only path to save Qin: absolute rule of law, iron discipline, centralized power, and total reform. Unlike Schacht, who had to disguise his fiscal policies behind a veil of technicality, Xiangyang reformed openly, directly, and without mercy. And it was precisely this combination of the Duke's vision and Xiangyang's rational ruthlessness that launched one of the most radical transformations in human history. No one in Qin at that time could have imagined that the policies then enraging the entire country were the very foundation that would, just a few generations later, turn Qin into the superpower that unified China. But before the miracle could begin, Qin had to endure the pain, and Xiangyang was the one holding the knife. When Xiangyang began to touch the greatest power of the Qin nobility, land, the entire court seemed to freeze. To the nobility, land was not merely property. It was the source of tax revenue, military power, and the very survival of their clans. But to Xiangyang, it was precisely that feudal land structure that was strangling Qin, keeping productivity low, driving poor peasants to flee, and weakening the state. Therefore, he introduced the boldest reform in Qin history, abolishing the nobility's hereditary rights to land. Land no longer belonged to the clans. It belonged to the state, and the state would allocate it to those who directly worked it. This was the heaviest blow ever struck against the class that had dominated Qin for centuries, yet it was the prerequisite for breaking the old feudal order. The second reform turned society upside down. Those who tilled the fields would own the fields they worked. For the first time, peasants were granted real ownership instead of merely laboring as tenants for the nobility. Ownership created an incentive that coercion could never match. They plowed deeper, maintained the soil better, optimized their crops more effectively, and within just a few years, yields rose visibly. Productivity, the very thing Qin had lacked most, began to surpass that of the richer, more traditional eastern states. But the boldest step was the reclamation law. Whoever reclaimed wasteland owned it, regardless of birth or background. This policy ran completely counter to the feudal model based on bloodlines, for landless poor, refugees from other states, and even those who had once fled Qin because of hunger. It was a rare chance to change their lives. They poured into Qin, turning once desolate border regions into a massive reclamation worksite. Every new field opened meant a new household established, a new labor unit, a new source of tax revenue. As a result, Qin's population grew while other states declined, and a manpower advantage that Qin had never possessed began to take shape. As labor and land both expanded, grain production exploded, allowing the state to feed armies, stockpile food, and sustain long-term warfare. An advantage that in the Warring States period only countries with strong economies could enjoy. The land reform also restructured the social order. When the nobility lost their land, they lost the resources to maintain private armies, lost the ability to rival the central government, and were forced to submit to the laws Shangyang had established. Meanwhile, peasants, who for the first time became landowners, became the new economic foundation of Qin. A large class of middle peasants emerged, loyal to the state rather than to clans. It was they who later became the highly effective farmer soldiers that supplied manpower to the massive military machine Qin built. In short, Shangyang's strike against land was not just an economic reform, it was a revolution in the structure of power. It transformed Qin from a loose aristocratic society into a centralized one in which peasants, not clans, stood at the center. And when the land belonged to those who worked it, productivity soared, population grew, food became abundant, and power was concentrated. Qin gained what every warring state's kingdom coveted, an economy capable of rapid expansion. This was the very first foundation of the Qin miracle. A miracle that began in the newly cleared fields, with peasants who, for the first time in their lives, owned something that truly belonged to them. After dismantling the land-based power of the aristocracy, Shangyang moved to the reform that made the entire Qin society tremble, establishing an ironclad reward and punishment system that struck directly at the economic psychology of every single citizen. To him, productivity could not emerge if laws were lax, and order could not be maintained if society ran on personal feelings instead of discipline. Thus, his new legal code was stricter than anything ever seen before in China. Every act that obstructed production, from laziness in labor, tax evasion, hiding population, concealing output, false reporting, to covering for criminals, was punished severely. There were no exceptions for nobles, no gray areas for officials, and no bargaining for commoners. That severity terrified the people of Qin, but it produced exactly the effect Shangyang wanted. No one dared obstruct production anymore. Yet, his most fearsome tool was not punishment itself, but the new social organization system, mutual residence, mutual guarantee lianzuo, in which 5 to 10 households were bound together. If one person committed a crime or evaded duties and the group did not report it, the entire group was punished. This struck at the deepest human survival instinct. Everyone feared being implicated, so everyone had to watch their neighbors. The result was a self-operating network of social control more effective than any bureaucratic apparatus. The state did not need to send thousands of overseers, the people policed themselves, and order was maintained from the bottom up. There was no more fleeing to other states, no more hiding output, no more tax fraud. A once loose society became as tightly meshed as the gears in a machine. However, Shangyang understood that punishment alone breeds fear, not growth. So he paired harsh penalties with generous rewards, a mechanism that had never been standardized in any state of that era. Whoever reclaimed wasteland gained ownership of the land. Whoever increased production received tax reductions. Whoever achieved military merit was promoted in rank and could even become a new noble. This was the deepest upheaval of all. Nobles could lose their titles, while commoners could rise to nobility. Status was no longer determined by bloodline, but by results. This policy injected fresh energy into the lower classes. Farmers eagerly opened new land because they knew the fruits would be theirs. Soldiers fought with desperate determination because they could change their fate. Artisans boosted productivity because achievements were clearly recorded and rewarded. Within a few years, Qin's labor productivity soared, partly because people feared punishment, but more importantly because they now had real incentives to work harder and better. The entire social system operated not on morality or tradition like the other 6 states, but on discipline, incentives, and efficiency. This made Qin the only warring state's kingdom capable of instantly converting social reform into economic power. The other states relied on family honor. Qin relied on production reports. The others encouraged merit through ritual. Qin paid with land, titles, and tangible benefits. It was precisely this combination of sharp rewards and iron punishments that transformed Qin from a state once dismissed as barbarian, poor, and backward into the most highly organized society in all of China. The gears began to mesh perfectly. The people worked harder, officials feared mistakes, the army had motivation, and the whole country ran like a machine gathering speed. Qin was no longer a despised backwater, it had become a power that no one could ignore. When the reward and punishment system had already turned the state of Qin into a single discipline block, Shangyang continued his attack on the nation's most silent yet dangerous weakness, the fragmentation of economic and administrative standards. He understood that a country is poor, not because it lacks resources, but because every locality operates under different standards, choking commerce and distorting central commands. Therefore, he launched the most important technical reform, nationwide standardization, turning Qin into the first unified market of the ancient world. The first reform was the unification of weights and measures, scales, rulers, weights, and volumes. Before that, every county had its own unit, every noble its own kind of scale. A sack of grain passing through 2 markets had to be remeasured from scratch, and merchants always had to guard against fraud. Shangyang decisively banned all old standards, issued a single national system of measurement, and imposed heavy penalties on anyone using private rulers. From that moment on, prices became transparent, transactions sped up, and disputes dropped sharply, a huge boost to domestic trade. But the most strategically decisive reform lay in something that seemed trivial. The gauge of cart axles, ox carts, and horse-drawn wagons were the main means of transport in the Warring States period, used for both commerce and military purposes. When every region built carts to its own dimensions, roads were torn up by mismatched ruts, carts overturned easily, goods moved slowly, and transport costs soared. Shangyang realized that if logistics were to be fast, every wagon wheel in the country had to fit the same rut width. So he imposed a national cart gauge standard, making tens of thousands of carts roll in the exact same tracks. This accelerated commerce, made grain procurement far easier, and most importantly, allowed the Qin army to march faster than any rival. After roads and measurements, Shangyang moved on to standardize the most critical area of governance, writing. China at that time had countless variant forms of characters, so official documents were easily misunderstood. An order issued from Shenyang could be completely distorted by the time it reached the border. For a state that was rapidly expanding, that was a deadly risk. He enforced a single unified administrative script, forcing all officials and localities to use the same system. Qin became the only state whose government apparatus spoke the same language, enabling orders to be transmitted faster and more accurately than ever before. Once measurements, cart gauges, and writing were unified, the final step was to standardize the tax system. Before the reforms, every region collected taxes differently. Nobles kept the lion's share and leakage was everywhere. Now taxes were calculated in uniform units, collected according to fixed rules, and controlled through the mutual surveillance system. The chain treasury swelled dramatically, not because tax rates were raised, but because the state for the first time knew it was collecting exactly what was due and collecting it all. With stable revenue, Qin could maintain armies, build roads, dig canals, expand production, and prepare for long-term warfare. From these technical reforms, something unprecedented in Chinese history occurred. Qin became a unified domestic market, where a merchant could travel from the western frontier all the way to Xianyang without having to change rulers, change scales, change cart types, or decipher different ways of reading official documents. Transaction costs plummeted, domestic trade flows accelerated, the volume of circulating goods surged, and the Qin economy, once looked down upon, began to outstrip the traditionally wealthy warring states. While the other 6 states still operated as loose collections of local aristocratic domains, Qin had become a single unified economic machine in which every cog meshed according to the same standard. And it was precisely that standardization that created the decisive economic advantage, paving the way for the explosive military power that would erupt just a few decades later. When is the full, accurate American English translation without any additions or omissions? When Qin already possessed a unified market and a legalist state apparatus that operated like a precision machine, Shangyang and his successors continued to propel the state into a new phase of acceleration, building national-scale infrastructure, something the other warring states could not even imagine. If standardization had helped Qin reduce friction in its economy, infrastructure allowed Qin to increase throughput, expanding production, transportation, and war-making capacity on an unprecedented scale. Qin fully understood a truth that modern empires also acknowledge: infrastructure is power, and whoever controls the roads, water, and walls controls both the economy and the battlefield. The first great project was the Lingqi Canal, one of the greatest ancient hydraulic engineering wonders in the world. Dug through treacherous mountain terrain to connect the Shing River with the Li River, the canal not only irrigated land but also linked 2 major river systems, creating a national inland waterway transportation route. Thanks to the Lingqi, the previously arid or abandoned southern territories of Qin became fertile agricultural regions with tens of thousands of new fields. Rice, millet, barley, crop yields soared, grain reserves became abundant, and most importantly, Qin now had the surplus capacity to feed a large standing army year-round, no longer dependent on seasonal harvests like the eastern states. The Lingqi was not merely an agricultural project, it was also a strategic transport artery that allowed troops to move by water, making Qin the state with the strongest domestic logistics of the Warring States period. But Qin did not stop at canals. They built roads, not village paths or market lanes, but national highways, the famous Qin roads recorded in history. Qin built roads according to a simple yet remarkably modern principle. Wherever they needed to fight, a straight road led directly there. From the capital Xianyang, great roads fanned out like spokes, stretching straight to the eastern, southern, and northern borders. These roads were wide, solidly built, and engineered for standardized axles to roll quickly and stably. Combined with the unified axle gauge, the Qin roads became the fastest logistics network of the ancient world. Armies could march in days' distances that took other states weeks. Merchants transported goods at unprecedented speeds, and the central court could deploy thousands of soldiers and millions of bushels of grain with a single order from the capital. Those perfectly straight highways were not just transport routes, they were the economic nervous system of Qin, binding all the nation's resources into a single unified whole. And to protect this newly reformed economic and social order, Qin constructed the northern defense system, the forerunner of the Great Wall. Previously, other states had built only scattered, disconnected wall segments, each noble responsible for his own section. Qin was different. They linked the old segments together, reinforced them with rammed earth, and created a continuous defensive line running along the entire northern border against the nomadic tribes. This was not just a military wall, it was an economic project. It secured farmland, protected newly reclaimed territories, and ensured the Qin roads could not be disrupted. Thanks to this wall, Qin could concentrate its manpower on production instead of constant defense, unlike the eastern states perpetually threatened by nomadic cavalry. But to build these colossal projects, Qin needed something the other states could not: mobilize nationwide corvée labor. Under the legalist model and standardized administration, Qin had the ability to conscript hundreds of thousands of workers simultaneously, not through blind coercion but through disciplined organization and clearly defined duties. Corvée labor was no longer arbitrarily controlled by local nobles. It became a standardized state obligation managed through the mutual surveillance system and clear reward and punishment mechanisms. The result was that the scale of major projects far exceeded anything contemporaries could achieve, an absolute strategic infrastructure advantage. The impact of this infrastructure was transformative: faster logistics, stronger production, greater military mobility. Qin did not just have more grain, they could deliver grain to the battlefield faster. Qin did not just have more soldiers, they could deploy them exactly where and when needed. Qin did not just have land, they exploited and protected it many times more efficiently than their rivals. When the inland waterways, national highways, and defensive walls worked together, Qin possessed a capability the other 6 warring states could not compete with: the ability to convert economic power into military strength in an extremely short time. This was the foundation that allowed Qin to transform from a backward state into the most powerful war machine in China, and the starting point of an expansion that would change the entire history of East Asia. Ever since the canals, roads, and city walls were integrated into a single strategic infrastructure network, all of Qin's reforms began to resonate and create something that historical records struggle to fully describe: an unprecedented productivity explosion in the ancient world. In just a few decades, Qin went from a despised borderland region to the fastest growing economy in all of China. The first and most powerful effect appeared in agriculture, where the Ling Canal, land reclamation policies, and private land ownership produced a quantum leap in output. Wasteland was opened up on a massive scale, water was brought to arid regions, and the people, for the first time truly owning what they farmed, worked with an intensity never seen before. The result: rice, millet, and barley filled the granaries to overflowing. Agricultural surplus was so great that Qin's population surged, more children survived, immigrants returned, and the labor force expanded exponentially. But high output didn't just feed the people, it fed the army. While the other warring states still had to carefully ration grain for each campaign, Qin could maintain a huge standing army year-round. And more importantly, this was not a large but weak army. It was the most elite fighting force of the ancient era, thanks to the system of ranks awarded purely for military merit. In Qin, a commoner could become a noble simply by taking enemy heads. This shattered the old aristocratic order and turned the Qin army into the only true meritocracy in all of China. Officers were chosen not because of their clan, but because of their achievements. Soldiers fought not for honor, but for a real chance to change their lives forever. Iron discipline from the mutual surveillance system, combined with economic incentives, created a fighting spirit that the other 6 states could not replicate. At the same time, a strong economy allowed Qin to break through in metallurgy. Sufficient tax revenue, abundant labor, and smooth roads enabled Qin to build large-scale foundries that mass-produced weapons to a uniform standard. Qin crossbows had greater range and power. Qin spears were more durable. Qin armor was lighter. On the battlefield, Qin was not only more numerous and more fanatical, they were better equipped. And when superior logistics infrastructure allowed thousands of tons of grain, armor, and weapons to move rapidly along straight roads connecting Xinjiang directly to the frontiers, Qin gained an advantage no other state could match: the ability to convert economic power into military power in an extremely short time. From the reign of King Huiwen to King Xiaxiang, Qin launched campaign after campaign, striking Han first, then crushing Wei, then annihilating Xiao, the state that had once regarded Qin as barbarians. Next came Yan, then the giant Chu, and finally Qi. Each victory was the direct result of a standardized economic administrative model. Qin did not fight with individual armies, but with an entire national machine organized as a single system. The other states did not lose because they were weak, but because they could not mobilize resources as quickly, deeply, and broadly as Qin. In 221 BCE, when Yingxing became Qin Shi Huang and unified China, the ancient world witnessed the final outcome of a century of reforms. A nation that had once been poor, fragmented, and despised had become China's first empire, created not by supernatural miracles, but by a series of cold, rational, and ruthless economic and administrative decisions. This was the rare economic miracle of the ancient world, a miracle built on law, infrastructure, organization, and productivity, rather than luck. Just as Qin's miracle was exploding, the first and most crucial instrument in the legalist economic machine was the privatization of land, a step that completely shattered the old feudal structure. Before the reforms, farmers were merely tenants working noble estates, with no motivation, no ownership, and no future. But when Xiangyang granted real ownership rights to those who actually tilled the soil, a new class of landowners instantly emerged. Ownership created what every agrarian state had always lacked: the incentive to boost productivity. People plowed deeper, maintained their land better, and invested far more effort because the harvest belonged to them, not to some noble who would skim it off the top. At the same time, stripping the nobility of their land not only liberated the farmers but also destroyed the very foundation of aristocratic power, leaving the central state as the sole controlling force. It was precisely this combination, individual incentive plus centralized power, that became the economic foundation, allowing Qin to accelerate past every rival. Next, to expand productive capacity at a pace that mere ownership rights alone could never achieve, Qin introduced a reward-based land reclamation policy, a simple yet enormously attractive mechanism. Whoever cleared and cultivated land received permanent ownership of it, regardless of origin or social status. This immediately drew a massive influx of poor peasants, refugees, and even people who had previously fled Qin, turning them into the largest land-opening labor force of the entire Warring States period. Every plot of reclaimed land became a new production unit, a new source of tax revenue, and a new settled household. Thanks to this policy, Qin's arable land expanded at an unprecedented speed, agricultural output grew exponentially, and the economy gained an abundant food surplus capable of feeding both the army and the population, laying the next critical foundation for imperial power. Alongside territorial expansion, Xiangyang implemented the mutual responsibility system, Lianbio, a collective accountability mechanism that tightly bound every group of 5-10 households together. If one person committed a crime, evaded taxes, or disrupted production, and the group failed to report it, the entire group was punished. This mechanism struck directly at human survival instincts, forcing the people to monitor one another, thereby drastically reducing administrative costs without the need for a bloated bureaucracy. Social discipline soared as a result. Fraud, evasion of duties, and desertion from military service virtually disappeared. Qin no longer needed to expand its officialdom to control the population. The people themselves ensured everyone obeyed the law, creating a foundation of stable order that allowed the economy to accelerate. On the foundation of that iron social discipline, Qin implemented an even more revolutionary reform: military meritocracy, in which the entire promotion system was based solely on battlefield achievements, with no regard for family lineage. This blow completely wiped out the chariot-riding aristocratic class that had dominated armies for generations, replacing them with men who actually proved their ability in combat. An unknown peasant could rise to become a general. An aristocrat who failed to earn merit would lose his titles. The formula was crystal clear. Enemy heads taken equal sign promotion, equal sign land grants, equal sign social status. This turned the Qin army into the most highly motivated fighting force of the ancient world, where every soldier saw victory not merely as duty, but as a genuine path to transform his life. Thanks to this system, Qin possessed an army that was both massive and elite, capable of overwhelming all 6 rival states combined. From an army already run on meritocracy, Qin went on to eliminate the economic friction that had long fragmented China through a nationwide standardization program, measurements, writing, axle widths, and taxation. Before the reforms, every county had its own ruler, every market its own scale, every region its own unit of weight. Merchants had to reweigh and remeasure goods endlessly, while officials could easily fudge the numbers. Shenyang wiped all that away, imposing a single set of measurements across the realm and imposing heavy penalties for any deviation, making prices transparent and transactions lightning fast. He then unified the administrative script, forcing the entire country to read the exact same documents and putting an end to orders being misunderstood. Next came standardized axle widths, so tens of thousands of cartwheels fit the same ruts, allowing goods and military supplies to move many times faster. Finally, he standardized taxation, abolishing the nobles' arbitrary levies and replacing them with a uniform tax system based on the new standard measurements. The result? Qin became the first unified market in Chinese history. Commerce exploded, transportation costs plummeted, and the central government could allocate resources across the entire country at a speed never seen before. Building on the standardization process, Qin carried out an administrative reform that amounted to a surgical redistribution of power. It established the commandery county system Zhuangjian, in which every single official was appointed directly by the central government, eliminating forever any locality controlled by hereditary nobles through father-to-son succession. This reform completely wiped out the feudal fragmentation that had persisted throughout the spring and autumn and warring states periods, putting an end to the situation where every region had its own laws and every clan its own privileges. Once officials owed loyalty only to the court and not to local aristocratic lineages, the state apparatus became truly unified, orders traveled fast, were executed uniformly, and corruption was sharply curtailed. This administrative foundation transformed Qin into a state capable of mobilizing the resources of the entire country as a single cohesive bloc. In parallel with its centralized administrative apparatus, Qin launched a national infrastructure program on an unprecedented scale, canals, roads, and walls spanning the entire territory. Canals, like the Lingguots, brought water to arid regions, transforming barren land into fertile fields and triggering a massive leap in agricultural output. The Qin roads, wide, straight, and solidly built, linked Canyang directly to the borders, enabling troops, merchants, and grain to move at speeds far surpassing those of any other state. Along the northern frontier, old wall segments were joined into a continuous defensive line that shielded farmland from nomadic raiders and kept logistics routes secure. When water, roads, and walls were integrated, Qin gained an enormous economic military advantage. Transportation costs plummeted, armies became highly mobile, and the ability to mobilize resources grew exponentially. To build those colossal infrastructure projects, Qin employed a system of organized corvée labor that was not the chaotic, arbitrary conscription seen in other states, but one grounded in law, with clear quotas and oversight through the mutual surveillance system. The population was assigned in shifts, by region, and according to labor capacity, ensuring continuous progress on the projects without causing agricultural production to collapse. Thanks to this tightly structured organization, Qin was able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers to dig canals, erect walls, and construct roads, projects that delivered long-term economic benefits, slashed transportation costs, bolstered border security, and created the logistical foundation that allowed the Qin army to outperform every opponent in every campaign. All those tools ran smoothly, only because Qin rested on the final foundation, the legalist legal code with iron discipline and an absolutely clear reward and punishment mechanism. The law made no distinction between noble and commoner. Whoever did right was rewarded, whoever did wrong was punished. No exceptions. This turned the entire society into a growth machine. Minimal stagnation, minimal waste, lightning-fast response to central commands, when every citizen knew exactly what they would gain by striving and what they would lose by breaking the rules. Individual motivation fused seamlessly with national goals. From production, taxation, and military service to corvée labor, everything operated in perfect synchronization, creating a rare stability, the perfect environment for the Qin economy to keep accelerating and for imperial power to expand without limit. Beneath that ironclad foundation of legalist rule, Qin achieved a level of power no other state could match, yet the very structure that produced the miracle also planted the seeds for the fastest collapse of any empire in history. Once the state apparatus ran like a machine, the people inside it gradually came to be treated as nothing more than cogs that had to keep turning without pause. Corvée labor, originally a tool to build roads, dig canals, and raise walls, swelled uncontrollably, becoming a colossal burden crushing the shoulders of millions. Mega-projects like the Great Wall, the Qin Shi Huang Mausoleum, and the nationwide network of imperial highways required astronomical amounts of manpower, and under the Qin Dynasty, labor obligations were imposed on the entire population at an intensity never seen before. Year after year, as soon as the harvest ended, corvée season began, the people were exhausted, families torn apart, and in many regions the population plummeted. The miracle built on forced mobilization revealed its dark side, rapid growth at the cost of draining the very lifeblood of society. At the same time, laws that had once been the engine of order and productivity turned into a steel cage that suffocated society. The slightest infraction brought savage punishment. Any attempt at flexibility was treated as a violation. Everyone lived in constant terror. When society had no room left for flexibility, initiative was extinguished. When every decision had to follow the letter of the law, the machine began to stiffen. Kearns excelled at mobilizing resources, but was fatally poor at adapting, a deadly weakness in the face of change. The administrative apparatus, once Kearns' greatest advantage, gradually became its own burden. The sprawling commandery, county system, centrally appointed officials, ledgers, measurements, taxation, inspections, surveillance, all of it required enormous maintenance costs. As the empire expanded too quickly, operating expenses exploded. Kearns resembled a company that grew at breakneck speed but never had time to streamline its organization, turning the structure bloated, expensive, and brittle. When Qin Shi Huang, the very soul of this machine, died, every fracture instantly appeared. The young successor Hotei lacked ability. The powerful minister Zhao Gao manipulated the court, tightened the laws even further, and increased corvée labor, pushing pressure beyond what the people could endure. And then the inevitable happened. Rebellions erupted everywhere. From Chen Sheng and Wu Guang to local strongmen, from prisoners to peasants, from soldiers to officials, every social class had reason to rise up. They did not revolt because they hated the unification of China under Qin. They revolted because they could no longer survive under the weight of coercion. Regions that had once benefited from the reforms were now wrung dry. The groups that had been most loyal, soldiers and land-reclaiming settlers, turned against the state because their obligations had become unbearable. The Qin Empire, seemingly invincible, began collapsing from within long before any external enemy could strike. And the most tragic part was the speed. It had taken Qin more than a century to build the system that made it strong, but it took only 15 years to disintegrate completely. That is the nature of a growth model based on coercion. It delivers immediate, spectacular results, but it relies on mobilizing human and material resources at a level far beyond society's capacity to regenerate. Qin did not fall because it was weak. Qin fell because it had become too strong too quickly, strong to the point that it lost all ability to self-correct once the people were exhausted and the system had turned rigid. The collapse of Qin does not negate the economic miracle it once created. It simply proves an eternal law. Every growth model based on coercion has a limit, and when that limit is crossed, collapse happens as fast as the rise that came before it. Though it collapsed in the blink of an eye, the Qin Empire left a legacy no subsequent dynasty could deny. It laid the foundation for the entire political, administrative, and economic structure of China for more than 2 millennia. The commandery, county system, unified weights and measures, standardized script, centralized legal code, and national highway network. Everything the Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties inherited originated from Qin. An empire that lasted less than 20 years yet shaped the soul of an entire civilization. Behind that power was no myth, but an economic miracle engineered through audacity, iron discipline, and resource mobilization on a scale never seen before. Qin proved a harsh truth. Growth, if organized with sufficient rigor, can accelerate almost without limit for a short period. Output can explode, infrastructure miracles can appear, armies can become war machines, and a nation once despised can defeat 6 great powers in just a few generations. But Qin also proved the other side of the story. Every miracle built on coercion comes at a price. When laws are too harsh, society suffocates. When corvée labor is too heavy, the people are exhausted. When the centralized apparatus grows too large, the cost of maintaining it becomes unbearable. Qin reached its peak as swiftly as an arrow in flight, but it fell just as fast once the momentum was spent. Qin unified China through organization and discipline, yet lost sustainability precisely because of the extraordinary speed it had created. And it is here that Qin offers its greatest lesson to the modern world, a world still grappling with the trade-off between efficiency and freedom, between speed and durability. The first lesson, concentrated power generates productivity. When fragmented systems are unified, when rules are clear, when the machine operates by standardization, productivity surges, transaction costs plummet, commerce accelerates, and the state can mobilize resources faster than any decentralized model. This is why many modern nations still see the strong state model as a shortcut to growth. But the second lesson is even more important. Every coercive model has a ceiling. When society is controlled too tightly, initiative gradually dies. When people are treated as mere tools, their endurance becomes the breaking point. When the apparatus keeps expanding, it eventually becomes its own burden. A nation can achieve extraordinary acceleration through concentrated power, but if it fails to throttle back at the right moment, if it does not return space to flexibility and creativity, that ceiling arrives faster than anyone expects. More than 2,000 years ago, Qin demonstrated to the world that extraordinary organization and coercion can create miracles and destroy those same miracles within a single lifetime. Thus, when we look back at the journey of Qin from a barbarian frontier state to a unifying empire, then into the flames of rebellion, we do not see merely an ancient tale. We see a familiar growth model. The greater the speed, the greater the risk. The more concentrated the power, the closer the limit. Qin did not fail because it was weak. Qin failed because it advanced too fast, too strongly, and for too long for its society to endure. That is the chilling warning to every nation chasing miracles today. If you want to understand the limits of growth built on absolute power, look no further than the empire that took only one generation to build and only one generation to collapse. If you want to see more economic history stories told with this same sharp, no-nonsense clarity, subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next journey.